The Grand Meridian's ballroom was a galaxy unto itself. Chandeliers, heavy with crystal tears, dripped light onto a sea of curated perfection. The air, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and blooming peonies, hummed with the low thrum of privileged conversation. Women wore gowns that cost more than cars, their laughter like the tinkling of fine glass. Men in bespoke tuxedos swirled amber liquid in heavy tumblers, their cufflinks winking like distant, cold stars. It was a world hermetically sealed, a bubble of opulence where the outside reality dared not intrude. And then there was Alara Vance. She moved through this galaxy not as a star, but as the quiet, invisible space between them. Her uniform was a simple, severe black, her hair pulled back into a tight, unforgiving bun at the nape of her neck. No makeup dusted her pale skin, no jewelry graced her throat or wrists. She was an entity of function in a room built for form. Her hands were steady as she navigated the maze of tables. A tray of champagne flutes balanced perfectly on her palm. But earlier that night, they had shaken. Not from nerves, never from nerves, but from a tremor that originated deep within her soul, a resonant echo of a past she kept locked away. It had started at table 6. A real estate heiress with a laugh as artificial as the diamonds on her fingers had whispered to her companion, just loud enough for Alara to hear, "Look at her shoes. Does she shop at a charity bin?" Alara's face had remained a blank canvas, her steps unfaltering, but her fingers had tightened on the cool metal of the tray, just enough to feel it bite into her skin. The small, sharp pain was an anchor, keeping her tethered to the present, preventing the tide of memory from pulling her under. That was 2 hours ago, an eternity in a room where every second was measured in quiet judgment. Now, she found herself trapped. Julian Croft, a man whose fortune was as vast as his ego, had blocked her path. He was sculpted from the very marble that tiled the floor, all sharp jawlines, broad shoulders, and an air of effortless ownership. His suit was a whisper of Italian craftsmanship, and his smile was a weapon. He was not speaking to her, but to the glittering circle of friends who orbited him. His voice, slick with amusement, cut through the orchestral hum. "I was just wondering," he projected, his eyes finding Alara's, "if the staff here possesses any hidden talents." "Tell me," he said, his tone dripping with condescension as he addressed her directly. "Do you even know how to dance, or only how to serve?" The question hung in the air, sharp and ugly. A ripple of cruel laughter spread through his circle. His girlfriend, Seraphina Thorne, a woman who looked as if she'd been assembled from razor blades and red silk, leaned against his arm. Her laugh was the highest and sharpest of them all. "Oh, Julian, don't be cruel," she purred, though her eyes were anything but kind. "Let's see if she can even take a single step without tripping over her own feet." A tech bro with a Rolex that screamed "new money" chimed in, eager to please the alpha. This could be fun. Let the help entertain us. The room's attention, like a great swiveling spotlight, snapped onto Alara. She stood frozen for a single, infinite second, the tray still in her hand, the weight of 100 pairs of eyes pressing down on her. They were waiting for her to crumble, to stammer an apology, and scurry back to the kitchens where she belonged. They saw a waitress, a nobody, a pair of worn, sensible shoes in a room of handcrafted Italian leather. They saw what they wanted to see, and they were all wrong. In the crushing silence that followed the laughter, the world for Alara narrowed to a single point. The glittering ballroom, the sneering faces, the weight of the tray, it all faded away, replaced by a different memory, colder and more sterile. The rhythmic, relentless beep of a heart monitor, the smell of antiseptic, the weight of her brother's hand, limp and cool in hers. He was all she had left. He was the reason she danced, the one who had celebrated every victory, who had believed in the black swan even when she was just a girl with scraped knees and impossible dreams. "You're not just dancing, Alara," her coach used to say, her voice like gravel and wisdom. "You're telling the world who you are." But after her brother was gone, she had nothing left to say. The stage felt like a tomb. The applause felt like an accusation, so she had walked away, burying the black swan along with the only family she had ever known. The memory was a blade, but instead of wounding her, it galvanized her. The tremor in her hands stilled. The fog in her mind cleared. She looked at Julian Croft, and for the first time that night, she truly saw him. A spoiled boy playing king in a castle of glass. Slowly, deliberately, As if placing a priceless artifact onto a pedestal, she set the silver tray down on a nearby table. The clink of metal on polished wood was the only sound in the now hushed room. Her movements were fluid, imbued with a grace that seemed utterly incongruous with her drab uniform. Every eye followed her. The quiet defiance in her posture was more powerful than any shouted retort. Julian's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flicker of surprise. He had expected tears or a flustered retreat. This silent, serene composure was not part of his script. To regain control, he resorted to melodrama. He pulled off one of his white gloves, an archaic, theatrical gesture, and tossed it at her feet. It landed on the marble floor with a soft, insulting thud. "Go on," he commanded, his arrogance returning. "Show us." The crowd leaned in, a collective gasp of anticipation rippling through them. This was better than champagne. This was a spectacle, the humiliation of a servant. Elora bent down. Her fingers, long and elegant, brushed against the soft kid leather as she picked up the glove. Her movement was not that of a waitress stooping to retrieve a dropped item. It was the beginning of a bow, the prelude to a performance. She straightened to her full height, which was not considerable, yet at that moment she seemed to tower over everyone in the room. Her eyes, clear and deep, locked onto Julian's. When she spoke, her voice was soft, yet it carried across the silent ballroom with perfect clarity. "If you want to dance," she said, her tone devoid of anger or fear, "at least keep the rhythm right." A shockwave went through the room. The audacity of it, the sheer, unadulterated nerve. Jaws dropped. Serafina's painted smile froze on her face. The orchestra, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, tentatively began to play a soft, gentle waltz, the notes uncertain, as if testing the air. Ilara took a single step forward, onto the vast, empty expanse of the dance floor. Her plain black flats made a faint, determined click on the marble. It was not a sound of retreat. It was the sound of a queen reclaiming her court. Julian, his pride stung by her quiet rebuke, strode onto the floor. He was grinning now, a predatory baring of teeth. He would put this upstart in her place. He would break her. He seized her hand, his grip punishingly firm, and took her waist. With a rough jerk, he launched them into the waltz, spinning her hard too hard, intentionally trying to throw her off balance. "Look, she's about to fall!" Serafina shrieked with glee, clapping her hands. The tech bro laughed, a loud, braying sound. But Ilara did not fall. For a split second, her eyes fluttered shut. She exhaled, a long, slow breath, and in that breath, she let go of the waitress, of the grief, of the past 3 years of hiding. When her eyes opened, they were different. They were alive with a fire that had long been dormant. She did not fight his aggressive lead. She absorbed it. She used his own momentum, his own force, and molded it into the dance. Her body, which had been held in tight, rigid control, suddenly became fluid, an extension of the music itself. Her feet found the rhythm as if they were born to it, gliding over the marble with an effortless grace that was nothing short of breathtaking. The laughter in the ballroom died in people's throats, replaced by a stunned silence. Julian felt the shift before he understood it. He was pushing, but she was no longer yielding. He was leading, but suddenly, he was the one being guided. With a subtle shift of her weight, a gentle but firm pressure from her hand on his back, she reversed the lead. It was a move of such exquisite skill and audacity that only a true master of the art would even dare attempt it. He was no longer dancing with a waitress. He was being danced by a force of nature. His confident smirk vanished, replaced by a look of utter disbelief. His steps became clumsy, his movements reactive. He was a marionette, and she was pulling the strings. The ballroom was dead silent now. The only sounds, the soft scrape of their shoes and the swelling notes of the waltz. Serafina's hands were frozen mid-clap, her mouth slightly agape. Who is she? A woman in a silver gown whispered to her husband, the question hanging in the air like a fine mist. At the edge of the crowd, an older man with a slightly crooked tie stood with his hands clasped behind his back. His name was Antoine Dubois, a retired choreographer of international renown. He hadn't attended a gala in years, but Alistair Finch had insisted. Now he knew why. His eyes, which had seen and judged the world's greatest dancers, were narrowed in intense concentration. He had seen that posture, that flawless frame, that defiant chin once before, on a stage in Paris. A girl who had danced with the fire of a supernova. He leaned toward the woman beside him, his voice low and heavy with awe. "That's no waitress," he said, his words carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "That's Alara Vance." The woman gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The name, once a headline, a legend, began to spread, a whisper moving through the crowd like a breeze. Alara Vance. Alara heard none of it. She was lost in the music, her body and soul finally reunited. Her plain black flats, the ones that had been mocked just moments before, struck the floor as if they were the finest dancing slippers, made for this stage, for this moment. She was not just dancing. She was telling the world who she was. Serafina Thorne watched, her face a mask of curdled disbelief. The narrative she had so enjoyed, the powerful man and the pathetic servant, had been ripped to shreds. The awe on the faces around her, the admiration for this, nobody, was an intolerable insult. She would not allow it. She pushed through the crowd, her heels clicking like angry stilettos. She cornered the orchestra conductor, her voice a venomous hiss as she slipped a folded bill into his hand. "Play something harder," she spat. "A tango, a difficult one. Let's see her choke on that." The conductor, startled but compliant, nodded. The lilting, romantic waltz stuttered and died, replaced in an instant by the sharp, dramatic, and demanding chords of an Argentine tango. The music was a challenge, a duel. A guest with a fur stole muttered, "This will finish her. A waitress can't handle a tango like that." Julian's smirk crept back onto his face. This was his territory. The tango was a dance of domination, of aggressive passion. He adjusted his grip on Alara's hand, his confidence returning. The spotlights tightened, pinning them in a single, merciless circle of white light. Alara didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Her chest rose and fell with a steady breath, and her eyes flashed with something fierce, something wild. This was not a challenge to her. It was an invitation. When the first sharp beat of the tango hit, she moved. She didn't wait for him to lead. She exploded forward, her body slicing through the air. Her steps were so sharp, so precise, they seemed to cut patterns into the floor. The ocho, the gancho, the bolio, she executed them not as steps, but as expressions of a story filled with defiance, passion, and pain. Julian tried to keep up. He tried to reclaim control, but he was a clumsy shadow to her fire. She led him through a series of turns so rapid and complex that his face turned red with the effort. She was not his partner. She was his master. He was no longer dancing. He was merely trying to survive. The crowd, which had been silent, gasped as one. Then, the gasp turned into a roar. Applause erupted, so loud and spontaneous it threatened to drown out the orchestra. In the back, a man with a goatee and a skeptical squint, a professional dancer himself, leaned forward, his eyes wide. He had seen the grainy videos years ago, had heard the legends. He whispered the name to the woman next to him, a name that confirmed what Antoine Dubois had started. "She's the Black Swan." The name spread like wildfire. The Black Swan, the champion who had vanished at the height of her fame, the prodigy who had redefined modern dance. It couldn't be, could it? A young journalist, her notepad clutched in her hand, scribbled furiously, her pen shaking. She'd come expecting boring speeches and fake smiles. This was a supernova. "Are you getting this?" she hissed at her colleague, a photographer with a camera slung around his neck. He didn't answer. His finger just kept clicking the shutter, capturing every spin, every electrifying moment. "This is going viral," he muttered. But denial is a powerful force. "She's just showing off," shouted a man in a pinstripe suit, his face flushed from too much wine, desperate to pull the room back to his side. Serafina's voice cracked over the music. "No, she's just lucky. A servant can't be the Black Swan." Panting, his face slick with sweat, Julian made one last, desperate attempt to reclaim his dignity. He sneered, "If you're so good, dance solo. Without me." He stepped back abruptly, leaving her alone in the spotlight, hoping her performance would falter without a partner. The cameras zoomed in. Thousands of viewers were now watching on live streams across the globe. Alara didn't hesitate. She gave a single, calm nod, and then she began to dance for herself. The orchestra, as if sensing the magic, shifted again, the tango melting into a haunting, powerful melody of strings and piano that seemed to be written from the depths of her very soul. She leaped, her body arcing through the air with a power that defied her small frame. She spun, her arms carving shapes that were part ballet, part jazz, part something raw and untamed that no school could ever teach. It was the dance of a girl who had known glory and the woman who had known grief. It was heartbreakingly beautiful. It was terrifyingly powerful. The crowd was on its feet, cheering, clapping, some wiping away tears they didn't expect. Richard stood frozen, his hands limp. Serafina's mouth hung open, her eyes wide with something close to fear. The world was watching as Alara Vance, the waitress, shed her skin and became the legend she was always meant to be. The final note of the music hung in the air, vibrating with the raw emotion Alara had poured into it. She came to a stop, her chest rising and falling, her face flushed but serene. For a moment, there was absolute silence, a collective breath held in awe. Then, the ballroom erupted. It was no longer just applause. It was a standing ovation, a roar of acclaim that shook the crystal chandeliers. People surged forward, their phones held high, capturing the image of the woman in the plain black uniform who had just held them all captive. "It's her," a woman in a pearl necklace kept saying, her voice shaking. "It's really her." But Serafina was not finished. Humiliation had curdled into pure rage. She shoved her way through the adoring crowd, her heels a sharp, angry staccato on the floor. "This is a trick," she snapped, pointing a trembling finger at Alara. "She's a fraud. She's a nobody, a waitress who got lucky with a few flashy moves." The crowd, however, was no longer on her side. The applause only grew louder, a wave of sound that drowned out her shrill accusations. Alara didn't even look at Serafina. Her performance was over. With a composure that was more infuriating to her detractors than any insult, she turned to walk back toward the table where her tray still sat. It was as if she intended to simply resume her duties. It was then that a new voice cut through the noise, a voice of quiet, indisputable authority. She is not just a waitress. Alistair Finch, the elderly, distinguished owner of the Grand Meridian, had stepped onto the stage. He was a man who rarely made public appearances, a figure of immense and understated power. The room fell silent at once. "Miss Vance is not, and has never been, an employee of this hotel," he continued, his words slow and deliberate. "She is our guest of honor, and I am privileged to announce her as the new artistic director for the entire Meridian Hotel Group." As he spoke, a massive screen behind the stage flickered to life. It showed grainy footage of a younger Alara, in a worn leotard, under harsh studio lights, her body moving like it was made of music. It cut to clips of her on world stages, the flash of cameras, the gleam of gold medals, the black swan in her prime. The evidence was irrefutable, crushing. The room erupted again, this time with gasps, with frantic murmurs as people pulled out their phones not just to record, but to Google her name. The programs they had ignored on their tables suddenly became objects of intense interest. There, under special guests, was her name, Alara Vance. No one had bothered to look. Julian stood as if turned to stone, his face drained of all color. Serafina looked as though she had been physically struck. And then, as if the drama of the evening were not yet complete, the grand ballroom doors swung open. A man walked in. He was tall and moved with a calm, deliberate grace that commanded attention without demanding it. His suit was dark, simple, impeccably tailored but not flashy. He radiated a quiet power that made Julian Croft's loud, performative dominance seem childish by comparison. No one needed to announce his name. He was Donovan Reese, a man whose name was whispered in boardrooms where fortunes were made and lost, a titan of industry whose influence was as vast as it was unseen. He was fiercely private, almost a myth, and he was Alara's husband. The crowd parted for him as if by an invisible force. He didn't look at Julian or Serafina. He didn't need to. His eyes were only for Alara. He walked straight to her, his expression soft. He said nothing, simply removed his own tailored jacket and draped it gently over her shoulders, covering the plain waitress uniform. It was a gesture of protection, of possession, of profound love and respect that said everything. He brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, and she leaned into his touch for a brief moment, her composure finally softening in his presence. She stood there, her husband at her side, her silence more powerful than any speech. Serafina's face went white. Julian opened his mouth, tried to say something, an apology, an excuse, but the words died in his throat. In that moment, he understood the colossal scale of his misjudgment. He hadn't just insulted a waitress. He had publicly humiliated the wife of Donovan Reese. He had mocked a living legend who was now being appointed to a position of immense cultural power. He was ruined. And he knew it. The fallout was not a storm. It was a quiet, clinical, and devastatingly efficient demolition. The digital world, which had witnessed Ilara's triumph, became the jury and executioner for her tormentors. The next day, Croft Industries issued a terse statement announcing Julian Croft was stepping back from public duties to focus on personal matters. A week later, he was quietly ousted as CEO by a board of directors terrified of the viral video of his conduct unbecoming. The tech bro with the Rolex saw his startup's biggest investor pull their funding overnight, citing a crisis of character in the leadership. Serafina's fate was perhaps the most public. Her carefully curated social media empire, built on a foundation of glamour and smug superiority, crumbled. The video of her shrieking, "She's a servant," became a meme, a symbol of entitled arrogance. Her sponsors dropped her, and her comment sections became a relentless flood of black swan emojis and screenshots of her own cruel words. She simply went quiet, disappearing from the online world she had once dominated. The society that had once adored her now shunned her, not out of morality, but out of a primal fear of being associated with such a spectacular fall from grace. Ilara saw none of it. She didn't read the articles, didn't watch the clips. She had no interest in their downfall. Her focus was on the future. She left the gala that night with Donovan, her hand in his, walking past the gawking crowds and flashing cameras without a single look back. She left her tray on the table and her apron folded neatly beside it, a final, quiet shedding of a skin that no longer fit. Her new office at the Meridian headquarters overlooked the city, a panorama of glittering lights that now seemed less intimidating and more like a promise. Her desk was not covered in financial reports, but in sketches of stage designs, lighting plots, and musical scores. The fire that had been rekindled on the dance floor was now being channeled into her work, her true calling. She didn't speak of that night often. She didn't have to, but its effects lingered, not as a scar, but as a brand of strength. The kitchen staff, who had once been her colleagues, now looked at her with a mixture of awe and fierce pride. The young waiter she had once shared her sandwich with now held his head a little higher, as if her victory was, in some small way, his too. One afternoon, weeks later, she was walking past a rehearsal studio inside the hotel. A group of young dancers was practicing. She paused, watching them through the glass. Her reflection superimposed over their moving forms caught her eye. She saw not the tired woman in the waitress uniform, but a director, a leader, an artist. And beneath that, she saw something else, something timeless and fierce that would always be a part of her. The black swan was still there, not waiting in the wings, but integrated into her very being. Years ago, she had stood at her brother's grave and believed her life's music had ended. She thought the black swan was buried with him. But that night, in a glittering ballroom full of hostile strangers, she had learned a profound truth. She hadn't been dancing for them for their approval or their applause. She danced for herself, for the girl who had lost everything and still found the strength to stand, for her brother's memory, for the part of her that refused to break. As she turned from the glass and walked down the hall, her steps were light but firm. The world now saw her for who she was, not because she had shouted it, but because she had shown it. The gala was over, but for Ilara Vance, the music was just beginning.